European growth, everyone's asking how to achieve it, but so far no one seems to be coming up with sustainable answers. Breakingviews editor Hugo Dixon joins me now to discuss a few options that leaders at the European Union summit meeting this week could consider. Good to see you, Hugo. You've got a tie on, so this piece really must be very serious today, I've got to say. We've talked about structural reform before, you and I. What's your thinking now?
Well, I think the key point that I'm trying to make is that you need to have a trade-off between the long-term structural reforms and less of the short-term austerity. I mean, that's one point. We've got these austerity spirals, certainly in Greece, Portugal, possibly the beginning of them in Spain, and then we need to find some way of saying, okay, let's not keep stamping on every sign of growth there is. I mean, that is the most important thing that can be done in the short run about growth. I mean, we've obviously had the first batch of the LTRO from the ECB, and we've got another one coming on this week. So monetary policy is pretty lax, but 23 of the 27 countries in the European Union are in this so-called excess deficit procedure, and the combination of that is probably the biggest concern now for the euro crisis.
Sure. So what are you saying, Hugo? You're saying give them longer to cut their deficits, but how much longer? Well,
maybe extend it perhaps for another year, but only, and this is the key quid pro quo, provided that there are proper medium-term plans for structural reform that will both lead to a more contained deficit in the medium term, but also to greater growth. Because if you do things on liberalising your labour markets, if you do things for pushing up pension ages, this will increase the potential of these economies. So, I mean, that's the sort of trade-off, and you're sort of beginning to see that. I mean, this is not, as you said, this is not a new point, but you are beginning to see the debate is shifting a little bit in that direction. You certainly had the IMF its tune earlier this year. You've had Mario Monti in Italy. He's been a very important voice in changing the debate on this because he has credibility. Even some, Merkel hasn't said anything, but there are sort of off-the-record signs emerging that there may be some basis for a deal between Spain and Merkel on this, because Spain is actually where the particular austerity spiral is most severe at the moment.
You talk about injecting new life into the single market agenda, and you mentioned the Lisbon agenda, of course, in 2000, which seemed to sort of fall by the wayside. How realistic is it to believe that something like this can be resurrected?
I think it's realistic to believe it can be resurrected. I'm not predicting that it will be re-energized. I think you have to work at it, and this is the other new point that I was trying to make today. This summit that we've got coming up this week, David Cameron has put the revival of the single market back on the agenda. You've actually got 11 other countries joining Cameron, so that's 12 countries in total, which is, I mean, Britain is not quite as isolated as perhaps one would have thought in the wake of that December summit, where it was
ironic that it's being spearheaded by David Cameron, this, though, I've got to say.
Well, it's always been a British agenda, the single market, and so, I mean, this is one thing that we've always strongly believed in Britain, but in continental Europe it's been a sort of a mixed bag. But you've got, what's interesting is the other 11 leaders who've signed up to this. You haven't just had, for example, the Dutch and the Polish who've always been keen on this. You've got the Spanish and the Italians who've signed up to it. And the most significant, again, is Mario Monti, because this is something which he's been passionate about for many years. He wrote the blueprint, reviving it a couple of years ago. And now, as the Italian Prime Minister, he has more clout than he did when he was just a sort of an outside professor writing pieces of paper. So somehow or other, I would say There's a chance. 11, 12 countries now. You need to. This doesn't require unanimity. Single market legislation in Europe is so-called qualified majority voting.
Yep.
So get a few more countries on board. But if they could swing, the key one obviously will be the Germans. If they can swing Germans on side, then I think that you have got a chance of reviving this.
OK, we will wait and see, and no doubt we will talk about this again. Hugo Dixon, many thanks for that. Hugo Dixon in Paris today. Coming up, HSBC outstrips its European rivals. That's in Market Pulse at 12. I'm Axel Threlfall. This is Reuters. Mike.